That night, Peter sat in a borrowed room, surrounded by people who didn't quite know what had happened. Some were weeping, others were speechless. The flames hadn't burned anything, the wind hadn't knocked down any walls, and yet something had changed in the air of that city so radically that thousands of people would come out to ask what was going on. It wasn't the first time the Spirit of God had descended upon human beings in the history of the Hebrew people. It wasn't the first time something invisible had changed everything visible. But it was the first time that this descent was for everyone, without distinction of tribe, without distinction of sacred office, without needing to be a priest or prophet by birth. And this is where something that seems clear on the surface begins to reveal layers that most of us never get to explore, not because we don't want to, but because no one showed us how to look. When you grow up in a faith community, you learn certain words almost before you learn to read. Gifts of the Spirit, fruits of the Spirit. You hear them in sermons, see them written on church walls, find them in the titles of books and conferences. And over time, without realizing it, you build a mental image of what they mean that has more to do with repetition than with actual study of the text. What happens to that image, inevitably, is that it becomes flat. It becomes an inventory, a list of things the believer should have or demonstrate. Speaking in tongues, prophesying, healing the sick, and then, on the other hand, love, joy, peace, patience, as if they were two sections of a spiritual catalog separated by a blank page. But the Bible doesn't present it that way. The Bible, when read attentively, with historical honesty, and with respect for the language in which it was written, presents something far more complex, far more vibrant, and far more unified than that simplistic image could ever convey. And understanding that difference, the real difference between gifts and fruits, not from the systematic theology of a denomination, but from the text itself, from the Hebrew and Greco-Roman context in which it was written, from the concrete lives of the people who lived them, changes the way one relates to their own faith. Not in an abstract way, but in a practical, intimate, and lasting way. Let's consider this from the outset. The word used in the Greek text for gifts is charisma, and its root is charis, which means grace, not merit, not achievement, not the result of accumulated spiritual discipline. Grace, something freely given, without the recipient having done anything to earn it. That's already a first crack in the flat image, because much of the popular theology surrounding gifts presents them as something that is attained, sought, or developed through certain spiritual steps. And while there is an element of willingness and openness that the Bible itself mentions, the fundamental nature of the gift is that it is received, not built. It comes from the outside in, not from the inside out. The word used for fruit, however, is exactly what it sounds like. Karpos, fruit. And here the biblical metaphor is neither accidental nor decorative. Fruit doesn't appear overnight. Fruit is the result of a process that begins long before the fruit is visible. It begins in the root, in the plant's connection to the earth, in the invisible flow of nutrients that rises through the trunk before reaching the branches. Jesus himself uses this image in the Gospel of John with breathtaking clarity. He doesn't say that fruit is the result of the believer's effort. He says it is the result of remaining, of staying, of not separating oneself from the vine. And that difference between producing and remaining is one of the most important in the entire biblical understanding of the spiritual life. Imagine for a moment what that means for someone who has spent years trying to be more loving, more patient, more kind, through self-discipline, through spiritual checklists, through guilt for not succeeding. The Bible doesn't describe the fruits of the Spirit as goals to be achieved, It describes them as the natural consequences of a connection that already exists. And if that connection is missing, it doesn't matter how hard the believer tries, because effort without roots produces appearance, not fruit. It produces an outward imitation of something that can only be born from within. Here I want you to notice something important. Paul writes his list of fruits in Galatians in a very specific context that most sermons completely omit. He isn't talking about fruits in the abstract as a list of desirable virtues for any good person. He's responding to a concrete theological crisis. The churches in Galatia were being influenced by teachers who insisted that Gentile believers, to be true members of God's people, had to observe the Mosaic law, beginning with circumcision, and Paul, in his response, builds an argument that culminates precisely in that list of fruits, as evidence that the Spirit-transformed life doesn't need to be regulated by external codes, because it already carries within itself the principle of its own direction. This means that when Paul writes about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, he isn't writing a list of virtues that the believer should strive to exhibit. He's writing a description of what a life connected to the Spirit naturally produces, as evidence that this connection is real. Not as a requirement for the connection to be valid, but as a consequence of it already being valid. And this distinction isn't a minor theological detail. It's the difference between a religion of performance and a transformative relationship. Now, the gifts. Paul speaks of them primarily in 3 letters: 1 Corinthians, Romans, and Ephesians. And each of these 3 contexts sheds a different light on what they are and what they are for. In 1 Corinthians, the context is the most dramatic and also the most misunderstood. Corinth was a cosmopolitan port city, one of the most influential in the first-century Mediterranean world, and the church that had sprung up there was a true reflection of that city's character. Vibrant, diverse, full of energy, and also deeply divided and confused. And the confusion that Paul addresses in chapters 12 through 14 has to do precisely with the misuse and misunderstanding of the gifts. The first thing Paul establishes in this context is something that still surprises when read carefully. He says that there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different kinds of ministries, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but the same God works in all of them. And this Trinitarian structure that appears in the opening verses of chapter 12 is not merely decorative. Paul is saying that the gifts are not individual possessions that the believer can use as they please. They are expressions of a unity that transcends them. They are manifestations of a purpose that goes beyond the one who possesses them. And then comes something that popular theology almost always overlooks. Paul says that each person receives the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For the common good, not for show, not for social distinction within the community, not to create visible spiritual hierarchies, for the common good. And the Greek word he uses is symphoron, which literally means that which is carried together, that which benefits the whole. The gifts, in their most fundamental nature, are instruments at the service of the body, not ornaments of individual identity. This directly contradicts how spiritual gifts are presented in much of contemporary charismatic and Pentecostal tradition, where possessing certain gifts, especially the gift of tongues, becomes a marker of spiritual status, a sign that someone has reached a higher level of consecration than others. And Paul, in that same chapter, almost as if he could foresee this future from the first century, dismantles this logic with a metaphor that has become so familiar we no longer hear it with its original force. The body. The eye cannot tell the hand it doesn't need it. The foot cannot tell the nose it is more important. and the part that seems weakest may actually be the most necessary. But the most radical aspect of the body metaphor is not that all the members are necessary. It's that all the members suffer together and rejoice together. That's the dimension we most easily forget. Gifts don't exist to elevate the one who possesses them. They exist to connect, to sustain, to heal, to build from the ground up. And when they are used outside of that logic of the body, when they become instruments of distinction instead of instruments of service, they cease to be gifts in the sense Paul describes and become something entirely different, something that may bear the same name, but no longer has the same nature. And then Paul comes to chapter 13, and this is where a superficial reading makes its biggest mistake, because chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians is not a poetic aside about love inserted between two technical chapters about spiritual gifts. It is the heart of the argument. It is the key to understanding why gifts without love are nothing, and why love is not just another gift on the list. Love, in Paul's thinking, is the atmosphere in which the gifts must exist to be what they are meant to be. Not a gift among gifts, not a virtue among virtues, the principle that gives meaning to everything else. When Paul says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal," he isn't simply making an observation about the uselessness of gifts without charity. He's redefining what it means to be a channel of the divine, sound without meaning, ability without connection, power without love. All of that, Paul says, is noise. No matter how impressive the noise is, no matter how many people are watching when it happens, if there is no love, there is no real transmission of the divine. There is only spectacle. I want you to pause here for a moment, because this has implications that go far beyond doctrine. Think about how many people have abandoned their faith, not because they lost belief in God, but because they experienced within the church a spectacle devoid of love, power without connection, gifts displayed on platforms while the most vulnerable members of the community remained invisible. Paul was already seeing this in Corinth. He was already naming the problem, and the solution he proposes is not to suppress the gifts, but to anchor them in something that transcends them and gives them meaning. Now consider the complete list of gifts Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 12. Word of wisdom, word of knowledge, faith, gifts of healing, working of miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, different kinds of tongues, interpretation of tongues, and 9 manifestations. And Christian tradition, especially in its more charismatic currents, has tended to read this list as exhaustive, as if it were the complete catalog of everything the Spirit can do. But when you turn to the letters to the Romans and the Ephesians, you find that Paul mentions other gifts not found in 1 Corinthians: service, teaching, exhortation, generosity, leadership, mercy, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And this multiplicity of lists, read honestly, suggests that Paul never intended to create a closed catalog. He was describing concrete manifestations of the Spirit in specific communities with specific needs. What unites all these lists is not a fixed taxonomy. It is a principle. The Spirit equips the body for what the body needs at each moment in its history. And that means the relevant question is not, "What gift do I have?" as if it were a fixed and unchanging type of spiritual personality. The relevant question is, what does the body need right now? And how is the Spirit equipping me to respond to that need? That change in question changes everything, because the first question leads to introspection as an end in itself, to the endless analysis of one's own spiritual abilities, to comparison with the gifts of others. And the second question leads outward. It leads to the body. It leads to service. It leads to the radical availability that is, ultimately, what Paul is describing when he speaks of gifts. Now, let's talk about the fruits. Let's return to Galatians in more depth, because there's something extraordinary about that list when you understand its structure. Not fruits of the Spirit in the plural, fruit of the Spirit in the singular. The Greek text is karpos, singular. It's not 9 distinct fruits. It's one fruit with 9 dimensions, and that grammatical difference isn't arbitrary. It's a theological statement. The fruit of the Spirit isn't a collection of separate virtues that the believer can develop independently, being strong in some and weak in others. It's a single reality that manifests itself in different areas of life. Imagine for a moment a cut pane of glass. What you see when light passes through it are multiple colors, multiple reflections. But the light that enters is a single light. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are facets of a single fruit that springs from a single source. They cannot be possessed in a fragmented way. When the connection with the Spirit is real, all these dimensions grow together, although at different rates, depending on the circumstances of each life. And when one of them seems absent, the question is not, how do I improve that specific virtue? But rather, what is interfering with the connection that makes the fruit possible? Let's consider the first of these fruits, love, agape in Greek. And here the Hebrew context is indispensable because the Hebrew thought that underlies all of Paul's theology has a conception of love that is radically different from that of the Greco-Roman world and, by extension, different from the one we inherited in the West. For Hebrew thought, love is not primarily a feeling. It is an action. It is a commitment. It is the willingness to act on behalf of the other, regardless of what the other evokes in one emotionally. The Hebrew term hesed, which is usually translated as mercy or loyal love, describes that kind of love that does not depend on reciprocity to exist, and it is this concept that lies behind Paul's agape. When Paul says in Galatians that the fruit of the Spirit begins with love, he isn't talking about a warm, vague feeling. He's talking about the fundamental disposition of a human being who has been reoriented from within toward the good of others. And that disposition, when genuine, naturally produces the other dimensions of the fruit. Joy that doesn't depend on circumstances because its source is deeper than circumstances. Peace that surpasses understanding because it's the result of a reconciliation that has already occurred at the most fundamental level of being. Patience as the ability to endure without breaking, and kindness as active gentleness toward those who are close. Here I want you to notice something that is rarely pointed out. In the list of fruits, the first is love, and the last is self-control. And that structure is not accidental. Love is what gives direction. Self-control is what gives form. Love without self-control can become chaotic, all-consuming, self-destructive. Self-control without love can become cold, rigid, self-righteous. Together, like the extremes of the same reality, they encompass all the other dimensions of the fruit and give them their full form. Christian tradition has tended to talk much more about love than about self-control, perhaps because self-control sounds like human effort and seems to contradict the idea that the fruit is given by the Spirit. But the text doesn't make that distinction. It puts them both on the same list. They are both the fruit of the same connection. And now we come to the central tension running through this entire conversation. The confusion between gifts and fruits is not just a theological confusion. It's a confusion that has real consequences in the lives of real people. When they become confused, when their natures are mixed up, two kinds of distortion occur. The first is the most familiar, the believer who has visible and spectacular gifts, but whose personal life doesn't reflect the fruits of the Spirit, who can prophesy with astonishing accuracy, but in their closest relationships is manipulative, angry, and cold, who can heal the sick, but treats those around them with contempt. Jesus himself speaks of this possibility in the Sermon on the Mount, and he does so with a disquieting clarity. He says that on the last day there will be those who come to him saying, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?" And Jesus says that he will answer them that he never knew them. Never knew them. Not that their gifts were false, but that the relationship didn't exist. That's devastating if you think about it honestly, because it means that the presence of gifts doesn't guarantee the presence of a relationship. Gifts can exist without fruit, and when they exist without fruit, they are powerful but disconnected from their original source. They are like branches that still have leaves but are no longer receiving sap. For a while, they still appear alive, but life isn't coming from them, and eventually the difference becomes visible. The second distortion is less well known but equally damaging. It's that of the believer who has been so exposed to the valuation of fruits as evidence of spirituality that they have built a facade of fruit with no real connection to it. They display patience because they know it makes them look spiritual. They act kindly because that's what's expected. They speak of peace while inside they are destroyed. That's a different kind of showmanship. Not the showmanship of gifts without love. The showmanship of fruit without roots. And it's perhaps more dangerous because it's harder to detect, both for others and for oneself. Paul was familiar with both distortions. He had seen them in Corinth, where gifts without love had become instruments of division. He had seen them in Galatia, where the pressure to conform outwardly to certain religious standards had replaced the inner life that the Spirit produces. And in both cases, the response was not to suppress the gifts or minimize the fruits. It was to call the community back to the source, back to the connection that makes both possible. Here, I want you to notice something that has a special depth when viewed from the Hebrew context. The Holy Spirit is not a novelty of the New Testament. In Hebrew thought, the Spirit of God, the Ruach HaKodesh, is the active and creative presence of God in the world from the beginning. It is the breath that in Genesis moves upon the waters. It is the power that descends upon the judges of Israel to empower them for specific tasks. It is what gives Bezalel, the craftsman of the tabernacle, wisdom, understanding, and skill in all kinds of work. It is what enables the prophets to speak. And in all these Old Testament instances, there is a common characteristic that is crucial for understanding the New Testament. The Spirit equips for a task, for a specific function, in service of a purpose greater than the individual. Bezalel does not receive the Spirit for his personal edification. He receives it to build the tabernacle. The judges do not receive the Spirit for their individual sanctification. They receive it to deliver the people in times of crisis. The prophets do not receive the Spirit for their own aggrandizement. They receive it to be God's voices in times when the people need to hear something they cannot produce on their own. And this logic of equipping for service is exactly the same one Paul applies to the gifts in the New Testament. What changes at Pentecost is not the nature of the Spirit. What changes is its scope. Before, it was selective. Now, it is for everyone. And that has enormous implications. If the Old Testament gifts were functional, that is, oriented toward a task and a purpose in service to the body, then the New Testament gifts are also functional in that same way. They are not permanent spiritual possessions that define the believer's identity. They are temporary and contextual resources for specific bodily needs. This doesn't mean they aren't real. It means their reality is measured in terms of their function, not in terms of their existence independent of context. Now we come to a question that many people carry within them, but rarely articulate clearly. If the fruits of our faith are the natural result of our connection with the Spirit, and if the gifts are functional equipment that the Spirit provides for the good of the body, what happens when one feels they have neither? What happens when one looks at their own life and sees neither the fruits they should be producing nor the gifts they should be receiving? What does one do with that feeling of spiritual dryness that one cannot confess in most churches without someone telling you that you must pray more, fast more, serve more? The Bible doesn't shy away from that question. It addresses it from multiple angles. Psalm 22 begins with the most stark lament in all of biblical literature. My God, why have you forsaken me? And these aren't the words of an unbeliever. They are the words of the King of Israel, the man after God's own heart, in a moment of such profound darkness that he can no longer find the presence he once knew. Jesus himself quotes them on the cross, which means that the most radical lament of faith is not evidence of its absence, but of its depth. Those who cannot lament because they fear that lamenting will define them have not yet reached the most intimate dimension of what the Bible describes as a relationship with God. And in this context of drought, the distinction between gifts and fruits becomes crucial once again. Because if one confuses fruits with spiritual achievements, the drought becomes an accusation. If one isn't producing love, patience, peace, then it's because one has failed. It's because one hasn't done enough. And this is precisely the logic that Paul dismantles in Galatians. The fruits are not your achievement. They are a consequence of your connection. And if the connection is in crisis, the answer isn't to make more effort to produce the fruit. The answer is to tend to the connection, to return to the vine, to remain. And staying doesn't always feel spiritual. Sometimes staying simply means not leaving, being present even when you feel nothing, reading even when the words seem empty, praying even when silence is the only answer. The Christian contemplative tradition has centuries of reflection on this and calls it the dark night of the soul. But what that tradition discovered, time and again, is that the dryness isn't always a sign that the connection has broken. Sometimes it's a sign that the connection is being deepened in a way that can't be understood from within the process. Here, I want you to notice something that unites the two ends of this conversation: gifts and fruits, in a single image. In John 15, Jesus speaks of the vine and the branches, and he says something that is rarely analyzed in sufficient detail. He says that every branch in him that does not bear fruit, he will cut off, and every branch that does bear fruit, he will prune, so that it will bear more fruit. And the word used for prune is katharine, from which we get our word catharsis. It doesn't just mean to purify, it means to go through a painful process that prepares one for something greater. Pruning is not punishment. Pruning is preparation. And the vine dresser doesn't prune the dead branches to punish them. He prunes the living branches so they will bear more fruit, which means that some of the most painful periods of spiritual experience are not a sign of abandonment. They are a sign that the vine dresser is working precisely on what he most wants to see grow. And that image, which Paul couldn't have known directly because it belongs to John's discourse, is the same logic that underlies his entire theology of the Spirit. The process matters. Pain has direction. Pruning has purpose. And now I want to close this circle with something I believe is fundamental, so that everything we've experienced together doesn't remain at the level of knowledge, but reaches the level of life. The difference between gifts and fruits isn't just a theological distinction for resolving denominational debates. It's a key to understanding how real transformation works in the life of a specific human being. Gifts speak of doing, of what the Spirit does through you for the good of others. Fruits speak of being, of what the Spirit does in you so that you become who you are called to be. And neither is more important than the other, but neither are they interchangeable. A life of gifts without fruits can be powerful without being transformed. A life of fruits without gifts can be beautiful without being useful to the body. And the Bible, when read as the unified text that it is, points toward an integration of the two. A life that serves with the gifts the Spirit gives, and that grows with the fruits that connection produces. That is what Paul is describing in his letters. Not a catalog of spiritual skills, not a list of virtues to attain, but a life lived in constant readiness to receive from the Spirit what the Spirit wants to give, whether for outward service or inward transformation. And that readiness is, in itself, the deepest form of what the Bible calls faith. Not the intellectual certainty that certain things are true, but the radical openness of a human being who has decided that they do not want to live solely by their own strength. At some point, if you pause long enough, you begin to notice that the most important question isn't, "What gift do I have?" or, "Am I producing the right fruit?" The most important question is the one Jesus asks those who approach him in the Gospels again and again, with a frequency that a hurried reading misses. What do you want me to do for you? The question of opening, the question of acknowledged need, the question that assumes there is something that human beings cannot give themselves and can only receive from outside. And in that recognition, which is not weakness, but the most lucid form of honesty, both gifts and fruits find their natural place, not as achievements of the believer, not as markers of spiritual state, but as living signs of a presence that never ceased to be available, even in the moments when it was most difficult to perceive. The Spirit that moved upon the waters at the beginning of everything continues to move. And the invitation that runs throughout the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is not an invitation to produce more or to demonstrate more. It is an invitation to remain, to stay in the vine, to trust that what is not yet seen as fruit is already being prepared in the roots. That's what the Bible says, not what tradition made of it, not what centuries of interpretation built around it. The Word itself, naked and alive as it always was, waiting for you to read it with your own eyes so it could tell you what only it can tell you.